right. All right, you guys can have a seat. So some of you guys that have let us know that you showed up late to church because you didn't want to do 2 minutes to talk. Turns out we hold all the cards. So what, we were talking about, this little moment of, and by the way, if you guys hear the screeching noise, that's just our air conditioning. But people wonder, why do we do 2 minutes to talk? Or why does it matter? And part of the reason that it matters is it's so important for us to connect with one another. It is so easy to come in and just come out of here. And it's really easy to do that. And I get it. Like, some people are introverted and some people are extroverted and all those things. And those are all wonderful things about us. But everyone in this room can talk to someone else. And we need that and desire it. And it's a really big deal. And so that's part of why we decided to move it. We wanted to continue to help as a community for us to get to know each other better and have a culture of hanging out. It's a wonderful thing. How many guys grew up going to church? You probably grew up in environments where people hung out way more. You might have been there multiple times during the week. You might have had, how many guys remember potluck? All that stuff, but those things are all wonderful things that were designed for people to be in community together. And so we want to continue to push on those things together. And so that's why we moved it there. And plus, you could turn around and say, man, you killed it during singing today. You can just encourage one another. It's so great. It's so great. We are going to be celebrating 10 years coming up in September. And so, which is great. Yeah, it's awesome. And so we're prepping a lot of things for that Sunday, and one of the big things that we're doing is actually we're putting together this 10th anniversary book that will be available for everyone. And so it's going to have stories and pictures and a whole bunch of things to kind of just celebrate what God has done over the last decade together. But we need something from you, all right, to help make that happen. This afternoon, probably just after the second service, you'll get a text if you're in our database and sign up. You'll get a text from us with directions of what to do, and it's really simple. You'll click on a link, and there'll be a question there for you to answer, and just answer it. It'll probably take you a minute, maybe a minute, but we just want, your answers are going to help make this book better and give us more content to use. And so we just want to know, essentially, why you're here, what drove it, and just for you to be honest about it. If it's hey, a friend invited me, great. If it's you were at the end of your rope and you need to know what to do, it's great. If you were just searching for God or a safe place to explore your faith, great. Whatever the answer is, just put it in there. And so it's be very helpful for us in putting this book together. And here's the beauty of it. Your part of your story coming here will help someone else as they're engaging this and help see what this community is really about. And so that's the biggest reason that we'll be having that book. So you'll get that text later on today. So we're in this series called Rizzdom, which is about living a compelling life, And it's interesting, this week I started, Joe Miller, who's our executive pastor, and I started giving out the checks for the share offering that you guys were so incredibly generous with. And we've had so many amazing stories already, from two of the people I got to hand checks to. They're why are you giving me this in June? And they're used to the end of the year, and to hear them share what a blessing it is to get it at this point in the year, and they can't, and I really mean this, they can't fathom the generosity of our church and what you guys have, or what we've done together in helping them do what they do and helping reach just different nonprofits throughout the city and thousands of people throughout the city. One story in particular is so cool. Even one of them, Joe had the opportunity. There was this one of the checks that we were writing to one of the nonprofits. They had just had a meeting that they were short a certain amount that month, and the accountant had just told the director, and Joe walks in with a check. I think it was it that day, Joe, or the day after? It was like within range that day, and it was for essentially the same exact amount that they were short, and we had like no idea. And so when we say that like God moves and God does miracles and that God provides, it's like, man, this takes on like a whole different thing when you start thinking about this idea of generosity. And we've done some incredible things with that. I want to talk about generosity today because it's the next part of this Proverbs 3 that we're in and what it means to live a compelling life. In the book by Viktor Frankl, A Man's Search for Meaning, it's this wonderful just look into what it was like during the concentration camps and how he survived. And he writes about how anyone survived during that time. And part of, as he's describing story after story within that, it's fascinating to just hear his take on everything and hear him describe what it was like underneath the Hitler regime and what it was like in that camp and what it was like for their interaction with some of the soldiers and to see some different elements of what was really going on there. Because you can see pictures and you see the atrocities that were happening there. But you hear some of these stories and it adds so much depth to all of it. And he talks about hope a lot, but he also talks about generosity in the camp. And it's like, here are people they're staring down death. They're staring down starvation. They're being degraded as human beings like we can't even fathom. And he starts talking about the generosity that started happening in between prisoners. When someone could feel that they were about to die, they would figure out how to sacrifice for some of the other people in the camp. When someone else knew that they were actually being walked to their death, before that they would do that, they would take their final bowl of soup and they would like look for someone who they thought needed it a little bit more than they did. And he would even talk about that some of the soldiers that were there that were just riddled with so much guilt, and they couldn't believe what they were doing, and they couldn't believe what they were a part of, like some of the generosity of the soldiers even within the prisons. Like it's like incredible stories that were happening, all centered around generosity and what it can do, even for people in total despair. But even to see the people had nothing but this heart of generosity, and that the generosity that was there was like guided by this hope that they had. This hope that they had in particular in God. And then there's this guy, they talk about him, Maximilian Kolbe, who was called the priest of Auschwitz. And there's this really interesting story about he was in the camp, and what was happening was he was ministering to a bunch of different people in the camp, but at one point in time, someone got in trouble, and they said, hey, we're choosing, I can't remember how many exactly it was, but they were choosing a certain amount of soldiers or a certain amount of prisoners to starve to death and to do it in front of everybody so they could just see. So they were just going to starve them to death and die. He hears about it, and he goes and he's praying over these prisoners, and one of the prisoners looks at him and says, I want to see my child again, and I want to see my wife again. And it was described that his heart was so deeply gripped by the internal pain that this man was facing, that what Maximilian did was he said, okay, I will step in your place and I will starve to death instead of you. And so he steps in, and it's exactly what he does. He ends up dying in this way, and he starves to death, and that man ends up actually living long enough and getting out of the camp to see his family. It was in this extreme generosity and sacrifice that he saw the depth and the internal pain in the injustice that was right in front of him. And the only thing that he could think of, because of his love, because of his faith and his love of other people, he's like, I have to step in here. I have to do this. Like, this is a responsibility that I have. And he does it. Or this guy, maybe some of you guys have heard of John Wesley before. John Wesley became very well known for the revival movements, in particular with the Methodist movement. And John Wesley was interesting. One day he was in his home, and he just put some stuff up and decorating and spent all of his money. At that point in time, he was making about 30 pounds total for his salary, which equivalent now is about $8,000. But he's making 30 pounds for his salary. He puts the stuff in his home, and he's used all of his money. He has no money left. And then he goes outside, and he meets this woman who was in deep need, and he realized, I just spent all my money on myself and I have nothing to give. And he has this very pivotal moment, and it reshapes his whole heart and his whole mind. And he determined right from that day that he would never, ever live beyond his means, that he would always live as if he only made 30 pounds for a salary. Like, that was it. Well, John Wesley, he became pretty well known and ends up going up and making a lot more money than that. It would be equivalent if you went from, in our time right now, if you went from $8,000 to $500,000, all right? That's how much his salary jumped, like, during that time. But he never, ever moved his standard of living. And he gave everything else away. And he was like, I'm determined that God allows me to live in this way, and he's like, and I'm just going to give it all away, because the heart of generosity, because of what I've seen from God and what I've felt from God and what I know of God, what he desires of me, and the responsibility that I have to follow Jesus in this way, says I have got to lavish people with generosity in the same way God has lavished generosity on me. And it gripped his heart. It gripped his heart, and that's the way he ended up living his life. And eventually he says this, he says, what should rise is not a Christian standard of living, but a standard of giving. What should rise is not a Christian's standard of living, but his standard of giving. When I was praying for our services all week long, my prayer was that we would be gripped by reality. The reality of the hurt in our city, the reality of the injustices in our city, the reality, the fact that the people are, like, we have stories here in this room of people that are hurting and in need, that we would be gripped by the reality of God's desire for our hearts to be so irrationally generous. And as I shared earlier, like, there are pockets where we do this incredibly well. There's some of you guys that do this unbelievably well and set such a wonderful standard of what it looks like. But my prayer is, like, God, would we just, our hearts be gripped by the reality of the responsibility that you've placed on us? And what this really means to live out our faith, what this really means to be generous, and why it is so important. You see a quote like this, and when I read this, I'm like, oh man, I don't love that. Like, I enjoy buying new things. I enjoy getting a new pair of shoes. I enjoy going shopping. I enjoy a little bit better of a house. I enjoy the addition. I enjoy a nice vacation. I enjoy. And anyone with me, or am I alone? Am I the only one like this? I enjoy it. And is there anything wrong with the enjoyment of that? No. Like, there's a beauty to something that God has created. There's a beauty and a fulfillment that can happen of experiencing different things and all of that. But I'm sitting there, I'm sitting with this quote, and there'll be another quote here in a second that is actually a little more of a gut punch than this one. And I'm sitting with this quote, and I'm just like, God, what does this mean? What does this mean for me and Lacey? What does this mean for our family? What does this mean for Max and Nevaeh and Ruby? Like, what does this mean? What does this mean for us to lead this church and this community? Like, what does this mean? God, what are you calling on us as a community? Like, how does this gonna work? Like, what does this mean for us? And how does it grip our hearts? And how do we take on the responsibility that you've placed in front of us? And I just sat there for a little while, and one of the greatest gifts that my mom gave me as a young child was, and I've told this story before, but I was in church, and someone gave me $1 for helping them out, and she took the $1 out of my hands and gave me 90 cents and told me to put the dime, in the offering plate. And I was a young kid. I'm guessing like probably roughly Ruby's age, 6, 7, 8 years old, and on the front end, as a 6, 7, 8-year-old, it's like, why would you ever do that to me, Mom? And because it's like the $1 was so crisp, but now I have 90 cents. It doesn't seem right. But what was she doing in that moment? She was instilling something in me that was such a big deal. Like, we didn't come from any kind of money at all, but the heart of generosity that she had, and the willingness to get that inside our brains and our hearts, And so that when it came time, even when I was like up and down in my faith and came back into the church and everything, one of the first things that I wanted to like get back into was giving. And when Lacey and I got married, we took that same concept and like that's what we're gonna do as a couple. And then for every year that we're married together while we're on this earth, we're gonna try and raise that to some level. And so we've done that. We've been married for 23 years, and we try and do it some percentage. We just try and give more every year. We started somewhere and then try to build on it. But that was a gift that, like, my mom instilled in us. We didn't have a ton of money. I barely had any. But it was something that was instilled in us that carried through to my adult years. But what was she trying to do? It wasn't that she was trying to make it legalistic. What she was trying to do and she was trying to instill in us is, like, and me and my brothers, and it was listen, we have a responsibility here to do this, to be generous, to give because of what God's done for us. This incredible generosity of the story of Jesus. It's like, oh, well, then we respond in kind. Like if we want to follow Jesus and call ourselves a Christian, then it isn't a suggestion, it's an expectation of us. And so it's like we step into this and do it. Well, in our this idea of living a compelling life, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that everyone in this room, when you're around someone greedy, you're not like, ooh, that's so compelling. You know, it's like, no, but when you're around someone who's like really generous, like I've been in the room with like some off-the-charts generous people. I have seen some of the checks some of you guys in this church have written that I'm like, what? I can't believe it. Like, and when you're around that, it does something inside of you to the very core of your being because you know it's right. And you feel it and you know it. And it's like, oh, wow, it's a compelling way to live your life. And I don't care how young or old you are. It's a compelling way to live your life. When you see a child be generous to another child, you're like, that's the way it's supposed to be. And you see it, and we celebrate it, don't we? When a little kid gives their toy to another kid to share, or maybe even to give, we don't go, you should have held out there for a little bit more. You know, it's like, no, we see it and we know it, and we celebrate it like crazy because we know it's right. And it's a compelling way to live. So there's something that we're designed to be as humans. There's something within it that we're like, oh, this is the way God designed us to be. It is not it's not a suggestion, it's an expectation. It is a responsibility that we have. Our verse for today is this one out of Proverbs 3. And again, if you're just hopping in today, it's fine. Like, you can hop in whenever. But we've been going through Proverbs 3 for the last several weeks together. But it just says this. It says, honor the Lord with your what? Just say it. With the first fruits of all your crops. Then, so there's this statement here, which is interesting. It says, then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. And it's this powerful thing that we think like, ooh, if I just do this part, then I get this part. It's not what it's really saying, but it's saying something. And I want to talk about that today because this idea of the responsibility that we have to one another. So to honor God, if you guys can remember when we first, a couple weeks ago, there's a part in verse 5 and 6 says, to trust in the Lord with all of your what? Heart. Not some of your heart, but all your heart. So all that we have. To trust in the Lord with all that we have. And to honor God in this idea, to honor the Lord with our wealth is a sense of like, there's a sense of reverence, a sense of holding in high esteem. And so when we get money, it's not to just spend it. It's like, ooh, like hold on a second. How do I honor the Lord? Like with reverence with this money that I have. What does that begin to look like? And what is it? And to honor is, and with our first fruits, the idea of first fruits, there's a lot there that I won't get into, but the idea of first fruits was a part of what the Israelites would do would be in the crops that they had and grain that they had. And the first thing that they would do is they would give to the Lord of their best and do it first. And so to honor the Lord with our wealth is that we are generous first. And my guess is most of us in this room, not all of us by any stretch, but there's a chunk of us in this room who when we think about our budget, when we think about our plan, and we go through all of the other bills first, and then we see what's left over. But to honor God is to say, no, we pick what we're going to give first, and then we build our lives off of that. That is to honor the Lord with our wealth. If we do it and we flip it, then we're not honoring the Lord. And we think to ourselves like, ooh, if I just do that, then I get all the overflowing. And then with new wine, I love a glass of new wine. That would be wonderful. And it's like, it's overflowing. Great. Then I get that stuff. Then I'm going to get all more wealth. And I was thinking about how sometimes when we think about how we interact with God, and it's so funny sometimes because it's like, oh God, if I do this, then I get that. It's like, that's not how, no. I honor God with my wealth because I'm supposed to honor God with my wealth. Hard stop. Not because I might get something out of it, not because, it's going to double my income, not because whatever. Like that's not why I do it. There's something, and to honor God with, there's something more there. It begins to strip us of our materialism. It begins to sacrifice for one another. It sets our heart in the right place of how we begin to see the world the way God begins to see it. See, God's not some investment so we reap dividends. And we can't think about it in that way. And we also sometimes think like, like when I get to heaven, that's when I get my payback then. It's like I was generous here, so now when I get to heaven, that mansion I'll get, the jewels in my crown, like all that different stuff. And I was thinking about we think when we get to heaven, we're going to be we'll be like Macho Man Randy Savage. We'll come in, and I don't know why it's not playing. It should play. But anyway, you think we're going to come in like this, or maybe like very regal and all adorned with all of these things. It's like, no, that's not how any of this works. It's not the point. When we think about what we're supposed to be, it's like, oh, no, I want to honor the Lord with my wealth. When we think about God's blessings, they are about multiplication. They are about sometimes bringing us to a deeper level of prosperity, but not in the way that we might think. When we begin to enter into this and honor God with our wealth the way that we should and be generous the way that we should, when we start seeing God, we start seeing the world around us the way God sees it. So sometimes when I see verses, I like to read them almost opposite to get the other point. So when you read it like this and you say to honor the Lord with my wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops, then your barns will be overflowing. So I like to sometimes read things like this. If I dishonor the Lord with my wealth, then I will get nothing. I will be left empty. If I'm not generous, then I am dishonoring God. And so I know it's the rougher way to sometimes read Scripture, but I like to do that to just give myself a gut punch here and there. It's like, this sounds good this way, but if I actually read it in the opposite way, that might hurt a little bit more. And so it's important then to engage then God is setting before us a responsibility. He is setting before us an expectation. And you might be thinking well, what does overflowing mean? Well, overflowing, can it be a material thing? Sometimes, it is. Some of you guys have experienced this. And you're like, man, I started being generous, and on the backside of this, it was unbelievable how God was blessing my business, or unbelievable what started to happen. That can happen. I've heard those stories. It can for sure happen. My story, and our Lacey's story is the opposite. We kept being generous, and then it's God's leading us to take pay cuts to get into ministry, or leading us to start a church and giving up your entire retirement fund. It's the opposite of those things, right? But my gosh, the blessing of overflowing. And so it can be opposite sometimes, but it could be sometimes. Could it be spiritual overflowing? Yes, all the time. Could it be we're providing for one another and communally? Yes, absolutely. The overflowing can happen. I love the story of the early church where it was a familiar practice that if anyone came into the early church and they were hungry or lacking of food, the entire church community would go on a fast of their own food to make sure everyone was getting fed. That was a standard practice. Everyone eats. It's like, well, how can you have that kind of heart? Well, you look into the person and you deeply feel, internally feel their pain, their need, the injustice, their sorrow, their grieving. And you think, I have a responsibility. There's no other way around this. It reminds me of this other quote, and this is the one I said is a little more aggressive. This quote here. It says, when someone steals another's clothes, we call them a thief. Should we not give the same name to one who could clothe the naked and does not? I just want you to just feel that. And listen, I'm not here today to again, we do a very good job with generosity as a church. But I do want us to feel the weight of the responsibility that we have. And the challenge that we have. And the heart that we need to have. Man, it would not be hard for me at all to come up and try to emotionally manipulate you guys. That people have done that for ages, and that's easy to do. I do not want to do that at all. But what I do want us to do is feel the weight of what we have. And an understanding of what is actually before us. I was talking about the all-in night. So if you guys were here last week, I shared some of this, and not the wealth part, but I shared this idea of this word responsibility. And I've been really taken by the story of Jesus when he goes before Pilate. And everyone's shouting, and they want Jesus to be crucified and everything. And Pilate sees Jesus. There's something in his heart that he's like, oh, there's something about this Jesus that this doesn't feel right. I shouldn't actually have him crucified. I shouldn't do this. And it's this interesting thing, and it's a description of what Pilate does in the moment that really has just kind of stuck with me. And it says that Pilate takes a step back, and he just goes like this with his hands. And he says, I'm washing my hands of any responsibility. That's it. And I'm reading that, and I'm just thinking about it, and I'm like, man, how often do we as Christians do the same thing? I'm washing my hands of the responsibility. I mean, I want the good part that you have for me, but I'm just going to wash my hands of the responsibility. And I want us to feel at such a deep level that we have responsibility. The expectation that is put before us. Jesus talked about this all the time, and about the expectation of generosity. He talks about it with, don't store up your treasures. He talks about it when too much is given, much is required. He talks about it with the poor widow. He talks about it with the rich young ruler. I mean, 25 to 30% of Jesus' teachings were centered around generosity and money. It's like, there's just something significant there. And what Jesus is putting before us is to actually follow him is to be generous. To not follow him is to be greedy. And that Jesus sets this expectation for all of us, this responsibility that, hey, do you want to inherit eternal life and what it means to be experience my kingdom? Then you have to be generous. Otherwise, you won't experience it. And so we got to have this. And Jesus talks about it all the time. Jesus is always challenging our idea of security. How many guys love to be financially secure? It's okay. We all do, right? I'm assuming no one's in here being like, no, it's so fun just being wild and insecure and not knowing where anything's coming. And I get it. So you budget. Great. You save. Great. I think those are all wise, biblical principles of how you handle your money. But if it's easier for you to save than to give, then that's a problem. It's twisted. If you think oh, man, God's calling us to do this, or God wants us to be generous, or God, but you know what? But I just like my security. Eventually, the fixation on security will lead to a disobedience with God. Again, I'm not telling you not to save. You should. I'm not telling you not to be wise with the money. You for sure should be. But what I am saying is we're fixated on it. And Jesus talks about this even when he's talking about storing up our treasures. It's one market crash, and how secure is our money? But how secure is our generosity no matter what happens? And Jesus is trying to lead us into that virtue and lead us into that thinking and lead us into that way of living because it changes everything. And so I want to talk about a few responsibilities here that we have. One, we have a responsibility to the person next to you, behind you, and in front of you. When we talk about community and when we look at the church and when we look at like the giving to the church and what it does and all these different things, and I'm going to go through some practical stuff here in just a second. But we have a responsibility to, and I have a responsibility now, you're all in front of me, but like I have a responsibility to be generous back to this church because I have a responsibility to all of you guys. All of you, not just some of you. If you're part of our community, I have a responsibility to all of you. So whoever you're sitting next to or is behind you or in front of you, you have a responsibility to them. That is the way community works. That is the way it is to be here together within all of this. We have a responsibility to build on the generosity of the people who started all of this. When I say this, I do mean our church, but I also mean like larger. But if you think about on a microcosm, our church, there were a lot of people who were so incredibly generous because they saw a vision, they saw a heart, they saw like God moving, and they were incredibly generous. And I remember one guy I sat with who had never given to another church before. He didn't even ever come here. He's never stepped foot in this building in our church. But we're sitting down, and he wrote me a check for $25,000 like before the church even started. And I was sitting with him, I was telling the story and telling him the heart and telling him like, and asking him about his grandkids and wanting his grandkids to have a place that they could go to church and all this stuff. And he goes, you know what, John? He goes, I've never given to any church but my own, but here's $25,000. Because I believe like what God has placed on your heart. But I think about that story so often because I think about, we have a responsibility to build on that heart that guy had in that moment. To build on it. He saw something and he knew something and he felt something. It's a pivotal point. We have responsibility to this city that God has placed us in. This is all over Scripture. Like responsible people make a difference. Responsible people make a difference. Irresponsible people do nothing. Responsible people make a difference. And it's like we have responsibility. God has put us in this city to make a difference. And we have, you guys, we have. We have a responsibility to make a difference in this city. Greed amplifies injustice, while generosity will attack it. And so if we have a heart against injustice, which we should because that's the heart of God, then we see like, our generosity becomes that. Even when we think about making a difference, it's like, through our generosity, we become answer to people's prayers all the time. We become our own little miracles that God begins to use. We have a responsibility to sacrifice. If you live a life of generosity, it's going to require you to say no to some things. It just will. If you think you're generous, but you don't feel like you're saying no or sacrificing, then you're not really generous. You just have a lot of money, I guess. And you can just like disposable income. So it's like, even in our generosity, you should feel it a little bit. You should feel like you're saying no to certain things. Sometimes when our kids will ask us to do certain stuff or try and get something, and it's all great asks, but sometimes we have to say no because it's outside of what we can do because we're not willing to dip into what we're generous about. And so you're going to have to sacrifice on some kind of level. Generosity is about heart first, discipline second. Yes, it's a discipline, but it's heart first, discipline second. And we have a responsibility, and this is a really important one, to the next generation. And this is where I want to get very practical. The way this works is that we have a responsibility to continue thinking about the next generation. I said this on All In Night. Like, I want us to look at every student we have, every toddler we have, every baby you're seeing held, and I want you to look right in their eyes and see that we have a responsibility to create a church that they are proud of. Create a church that exemplifies who Jesus is, to create a generosity, to say like, I want you guys to see what generosity really looks like. If you see an 11-year-old walking through there, guess what? They're not bringing much to the table financially, but they are with heart. They are with so many other things. They're so important to our community. But we as adults It's like, no, we have a responsibility to see them for who they are. We have a responsibility to like build something here that shows what Jesus is really like. And it's not about fancy new things. It's the heart to serve. It's the heart to give. It's the heart to make a difference. And so they'll walk away and they get this picture of who Jesus is. So from a practical way, our budget this year will be about $2.4 million. And so, which sounds like a lot of money because it is. Like anything with million attached to it, it's always going to be a lot. But $2.4 million. I ran the numbers this week that if I took the median salary of just kind of our area and then looked at the active adults in our church, and every adult only gave 5%. That's it, 5%. Our budget would be $5.9 million. So we would have $3.5 million more to figure out how to bless this city, how to make a difference in this city. And that's just like, I would venture to guess, some of you guys already give more than 5%, but like I would venture to guess that almost everyone in this room, I know it's not everyone, but almost everyone in this room could do something like that. To have a heart to do that, and you begin to see that. Even if like, this is like a crazy number, if every adult gave 20 extra bucks a month, it would grow our budget by $400,000. It's wild. Again, it's just math. And so, but it's wild to think about how all of this works. Like the government even sets it up wonderfully to be like, oh, you get like tax breaks for giving and everything. It's like they are trying to encourage it. But I just want you to feel this and hear like the possibility of what we can all do together. And so I know most of us also in this room care about where our money goes and why it matters. And so let me give you a list of what this looks like. This isn't even a full list. But this is like when you talk about when you give to this community and you're giving to one another, does it really make an impact? And I just want you to see this. And if you want the receipts, we'll show them to you. But I just want you to see like all of the things that your giving is doing. This represents thousands and thousands and thousands of people that we're impacting. This represents some people that you're sitting next to right now because of your generosity helps someone else in like a horrible time of life. This represents when you see some of the kids. Like, this represents so many different things. We bought this building last September. That's part of it. Like, and to be good stewards of this building is part of like, and making this a community center like we want to make it. Like, that's part of it. You think about all of these different things. I'm not going to go through all of them. But even just if you just look at today, I mean, even like the ability of your generosity, like to create a space where it's like safe for people to explore the faith. Create environments that people want to come into. Create this kind of culture of everything. It's like, well, how does that happen? Through our generosity together. When you think about even things like the staff here and everything else, like that's all part of your generosity. But man, it's helping so many people. Like, what an unbelievable return on your investment. Like, unbelievable. It helps thousands and thousands of people. Here's a question I just want you to wrestle with. Will our kids tell the story of God's generosity because they've seen how we have modeled it? Just think about this like as a community. I wrote this question down personally, but then I decided to share it communally. But it's like, for us as a community, and it doesn't matter if you have kids or not, but it's like to take a step and think, man, will the kids of our Hill City community, will they be able to tell the story of the generosity and the goodness of God because of what they saw and those that had the responsibility to show it? And so I wanted to say something practical here today that, and then I'll close this in prayer. If this is your church home, if this is not your church home and you're just trying to figure this out, I probably should have said this on the front end. Don't worry about this. Like, wherever your home church is, like, that's where you get. But if this is, or if you're just trying to figure out faith and you're just entering into this, like, just take a breath. It's okay. But if you call yourself a Christian and this is your church home, what I would love for you to do today, and you could do it right now on your phone, I don't care. I would just love for you to just like type in your salary into the calculator on your phone. And I don't care if you type in 2%, 3%, 4%, whatever. And like look at the number and be like, no, I could do this a month, whatever that number is. I'm not telling you to do 10. I mean, if you want to, you can. But like, I'm just telling you to just figure out like, what is the number? And listen, if like you're in a very rough season financially, like I get it. I'm not putting this on you, but like what is that number of what does it look like for you right now to just start if you haven't started? And then if you have been someone who's been giving for quite some time, maybe you forgot that, inflation happens or different things happen and you just kind of been in the same spot. Or maybe you've just kind of forgot like, maybe I should like think about what does this mean to maybe I can increase it 0.2% this year. Or maybe I can increase it 1%. Or maybe I can do it, whatever it is. Like that is my ask. And it's my ask not because like the staff needs a pay raise. It's my ask because what I want driven inside of us is this idea we have a responsibility to model the generosity of God. And God has given us this gift of this Richmond community. And all of its beauty and splendor and all of its ugliness and injustices has given us an opportunity to make, we can be a light in this world. We can show people what God's really about. Will you pray with me? God, I just hope we'll be gripped by this idea of what we're responsible for. This idea of the responsibility that we have to show people what your generosity is really like. The responsibility we have to image and represent and be a witness to how generous you've been to us. God, I pray that we would have eyes that for every single student and child we see in this church, that there would be something that grips our hearts that says, they need to know the generosity of God, and it's my responsibility to help show them that. God, I pray that we would be gripped by the reality of what you've placed before us. This beautiful, beautiful, what a time to be alive. What a time to make a difference. What a time to step into a chaotic world with this beautiful picture of the order that you can have in front of us. This beautiful picture of what it looks like, God, to love you and worship you and serve you and to make a difference. What an incredible and humbling responsibility you've placed on us. So God, thank you for all of the generous people in this church that are already here. Thank you for the wonderful work that, God, you have done through all of these people and all of the folks in this community that have sacrificially given. Thank you for the stories that we've heard even this week, with how generosity is so incredibly helpful. And God, I just want to also preemptively thank you for all you're going to do in this community as we all are taking a step forward in this. And we're engaging and it's exciting to think about what the overflow will look like and be like for us as a community. So God, I realize it starts with our hearts, and so whatever that means for all of us in this room, for some it's like choosing you, for some it's dealing with some things that are interrupting it, but it starts with our hearts. And so, God, I pray we want to choose you. And we give this to you in your name. We pray, everyone said, amen. If you want prayer before you get out of here, the people on either side of the